George Miller's breath misted in the cold air as he trudged along the snow-covered sidewalk. The rhythmic crunch of his boots the only sound in the stillness of the sleepy town. The sun was barely up, casting a pale light over the world, and the chill of early winter hung in the air like a heavy blanket. The streets of this small, rural American town were quiet, the houses old and sturdy, their rooftops dusted with fresh snow. The town felt frozen in time, much like George himself. It had been 10 years since his wife, Evelyn, passed away. She had been his world. Their home, the little cottage on the outskirts of town, still held echoes of her presence. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, a reminder of mornings spent baking together. The living room, though empty now, still held the warmth of her laughter. But over time, the silence had swallowed it all, and George had grown accustomed to it. No children, no family to fill the space. It was just him and the old house, weathering the years together. Most days, George would rise early, make himself a cup of black coffee, and head out for his walk to the local cafe. The cafe was a place of comfort, a familiar stop where he could watch the world go by. The locals were kind enough, nodding in his direction when they saw him, but nobody really knew him anymore. He was a ghost in this town, a man of the past, not part of its present. And truth be told, he liked it that way. There was less pain in solitude, less room for reminders of what he had lost. That morning, as he walked to the cafe, his thoughts drifted back to Evelyn. He always thought about her, of course, but today it seemed more vivid. He could almost hear her voice calling out to him, teasing him about how he never made the bed right. A fleeting smile touched his lips, but it faded quickly. The wind picked up, cutting through his heavy coat, urging him to hurry. He was almost there when something strange caught his attention. From behind the cafe, a small noise, a faint sound like a whimper or a soft cry, reached his ears. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or perhaps his imagination playing tricks on him in the quiet of the morning. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft, pitiful moan that didn't belong to the usual hum of the town. George stopped in his tracks, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His eyes narrowed as he turned toward the sound, coming from the alley behind the cafe. Curiosity, more than anything, nudged him forward. He didn't often venture into this part of town, but something about that sound made his heart beat a little faster. He made his way down the narrow alley, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. The smell of old coffee and grease wafted from the cafe's back door, mixing with the sharp tang of winter air. As he rounded the corner, he froze. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, maybe a cat or a dog, abandoned in the cold. But then his eyes fell on the small, hunched figure curled up by the trash bins. It was a person, a child, no older than 10 or 11, shivering and wrapped in ragged clothes. The child's face was hidden in their knees, but George could see the pale, trembling hands clutching at the fabric. Without thinking, George's feet moved forward, carrying him to the child's side. He crouched down slowly, his old joints protesting the movement. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough from years of disuse. The child didn't respond, just continued to tremble in the cold. Their thin body curled tightly in on itself as if trying to disappear into the earth. He reached out gently, placing a hand on the child's shoulder. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, his voice softer now. The child flinched but didn't pull away. Slowly, the child raised their head, revealing a face smudged with dirt, cheeks streaked with the tracks of old tears. Their eyes were wide with fear, bloodshot and tired. "Please, don't call the cops," the child whispered, voice barely audible. George frowned, his heart sinking. He hadn't thought about calling anyone. He wasn't even sure who to call. He wasn't used to dealing with situations like this. He had always been a soldier, a man used to following orders, not someone who had ever thought about what it meant to take care of a child. "I'm not going to call anyone," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. "What happened to you? Why are you out here in the cold?" The child didn't answer immediately. Instead, they shuddered, pulling the ragged blanket tighter around their shoulders. The silence stretched out between them, and George could feel the emptiness of the town pressing in, the coldness of the world outside. I ran away," the child said finally, voice cracking. They don't care. I just wanted to get away." George's heart twisted. He didn't need to ask who they were. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know what it was like to be abandoned, to be left behind in a world that didn't seem to care. But this was different. This was a child, someone who should have had protection, someone who should have been cared for. And yet here they were, shivering in the alley, alone. "You don't have to be out here," George said, his voice soft but firm. "You can come with me. I've got a place. It's warm." The child hesitated, looking up at him with uncertainty in their eyes. But something in his tone, perhaps the gentleness he rarely used, seemed to reassure them. Slowly, they stood, their small bodies shaking as they wrapped the blanket around themselves more tightly. George offered his arm, and the child took it cautiously, leaning against him for support. Together, they walked back toward his house, the wind biting at their skin. But George didn't mind. He wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years, the world didn't feel quite so cold. The morning after George had taken the child in, the air was still crisp, the sky overcast with a promise of snow. It was another ordinary day in a small, sleepy town where time seemed to move slower, and the world outside George's window was hushed under layers of winter. He woke up to the usual silence in his home, the kind that had become both a companion and a curse over the years. The child, he didn't even know her name yet, was asleep on the couch, a tattered blanket pulled over her small frame. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had done and what it might mean. But today was different. For the first time in a long while, the house felt less empty, less cold. He took a deep breath and made his way to the kitchen to start the coffee. But as he opened the back door to step outside, he froze. A soft whimper pierced the quiet morning air, coming from the side of the house. George paused, his senses sharpening. The sound was familiar, but not in the way he expected. His heart raced as he quickly moved toward the source, a gnawing feeling in his gut. As he rounded the corner of the house, his breath caught in his throat. There, near the trash bins, was a small, trembling creature. It was a puppy, barely more than a handful of fur and bones, crouched in the snow. Its fur was matted with dirt and mud, its tiny body shaking from the cold. The puppy's eyes, wide and fearful, stared up at him, and for a moment, George's heart clenched in his chest. The animal looked so fragile, so lost, just like the child inside his home. George moved toward the puppy slowly, not sure if it would run away or remain in place. He didn't want to scare it. The poor thing looked as though it hadn't eaten in days, its ribs visible beneath its fur. As he got closer, he noticed something else, a small, worn collar around the puppy's neck. The metal tag had been scratched and weathered by time, but there was still a faint inscription on it. Charlie. Charlie, George murmured to himself. The name seemed to hit him like a wave. The puppy's eyes met his, and George couldn't shake the feeling that the animal was somehow asking for help. As if it understood the despair in his own heart, George kneeled down, careful not to startle it, and extended his hand. The puppy flinched at first but then cautiously took a step closer. Drawn to the warmth of his outstretched hand, he rubbed the dog's head gently, trying to comfort it. The fur was matted and grimy, but beneath the dirt, George could feel the soft tremble of the tiny creature. His heart softened. The little dog was so vulnerable, so defenseless. It reminded him too much of the child inside, so fragile, so in need of something more than the cold world could offer. For a moment, George just sat there, lost in the puppy's gaze, trying to make sense of the emotions that were bubbling up within him. He hadn't wanted to deal with any of this, hadn't wanted to take in a child, hadn't wanted to take on the responsibility of another life. He was too old for this. He had spent the last decade alone, surrounded by his memories, and he had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the emptiness. He had told himself that he didn't need anyone else, that his solitude was enough. He had promised himself he would never again allow someone to depend on him. Not after Evelyn was gone. And yet here he was, staring at this little puppy, unable to look away. He thought about the child inside, still sleeping on his couch, and how he had made a promise to her, how he had taken her in because he couldn't just let her suffer. But a puppy, a dog? George had never considered himself much of an animal person. He wasn't sure he could handle the responsibility of caring for a dog. Not at his age. The thought of adding another life to his household felt overwhelming. But then he looked at Charlie again, the dog's eyes still full of fear, full of need. He had seen that same look in the eyes of so many soldiers he had served with. So many people who had been broken and abandoned by the world. And he couldn't bring himself to turn away from it. Damn it, George muttered under his breath, his voice gruff with the weight of his own conflict. I can't just leave you out here like this. He reached down and gently lifted the puppy into his arms. The little dog didn't fight him. Instead, it nestled into the warmth of his chest, as if it knew it had found someone who wouldn't let it down. For a brief moment, George closed his eyes, feeling the fragile warmth of the animal in his arms. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he felt this sudden compulsion to take on yet another responsibility when he had been so determined to keep to himself. But he couldn't ignore the pull, the sense of duty that had been drilled into him over the years. The same sense that had driven him to help a frightened child just hours before. As he walked back into the house with the puppy, he saw the child stir, waking up from her sleep. Her eyes were still heavy with exhaustion, but when she saw the puppy in his arms, her face lit up with a small, tentative smile. Is that a dog?" she asked, her voice still rough from sleep. "Yeah," George said, setting the puppy down gently on the floor. "I think he's been abandoned too." The child kneeled down cautiously, reaching out a hand to the dog. Charlie sniffed at her for a moment before nuzzling into her palm. And for the first time in what felt like a long time, George saw a genuine sense of connection between the two of them. The child's smile widened as the puppy licked her fingers. George stood by, watching the scene unfold before him, the weight of his decision settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, or whether he was capable of caring for both the child and the dog. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Maybe it was the puppy, or maybe it was the child, or maybe it was both of them together. But in that moment, George realized something that had eluded him for a long time. It wasn't about being strong enough to take care of them. It was about giving them the chance they deserved. And maybe, just maybe, in caring for them, he would find something he hadn't known he had lost, a reason to keep going. A reason to hope. Charlie looked up at him with those same sad eyes. But now there was something else there too, trust. And that, more than anything, made George's heart ache in a way he hadn't expected. George had never imagined that a small, trembling puppy could change so much in his life. But when he brought Charlie inside, everything felt different. The house, once a hollow place filled with echoes of the past, began to hum with a quiet, tentative energy. It wasn't just the child, the girl who was still adjusting to this strange new life of hers. It was the dog, too, who slowly started to transform the space around them. At first, Charlie was distant. The poor thing had been through so much. And though George could see the fear in its eyes, he didn't rush it. He wasn't in any hurry. Every time he tried to get too close, the puppy would shrink away, curling into a corner or hiding beneath the couch. George understood that fear. He'd seen it before, many years ago, in the eyes of soldiers he'd served with, eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. It was a fear that ran deep, a fear of being hurt again, of being abandoned again. And Charlie had every reason to be scared. But George wasn't going to give up on him. The first day, he didn't do much except give the puppy some space. He left a small bowl of water and a bit of food out. Then went about his usual routine, making his coffee, sitting in his chair by the window, watching the world go by. He didn't push. He just let Charlie adjust at his own pace. By the second day, George decided it was time to get the puppy cleaned up. He wasn't sure how Charlie would react, but he knew it was necessary. The poor dog's fur was thick with dirt and grime, a mix of mud and filth that had caked into the fur like armor. The first few moments were tense. As soon as George tried to approach Charlie with a towel, the puppy backed up, eyes wide with alarm, a soft whine escaping its throat. "It's okay," George said softly, his voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." Charlie didn't believe him at first, but after a few minutes, when George gently reached out and rubbed the dog's head, Charlie began to settle. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The water was warm, and George carefully bathed the dog, watching as the dirt rinsed away, revealing the soft, dark fur underneath. For a brief moment, as he worked, George's thoughts wandered. He couldn't help but remember the dog he had had all those years ago. Back when he was still in the army, that dog had been a mutt. Just like Charlie, small, scrappy, with fur that was never quite as clean as it should have been. But full of loyalty and love. The dog had followed him everywhere, even into the most dangerous of situations. It was that dog who had kept George grounded, who had given him something to come back to after every mission. Every long night spent in foreign lands. They had a bond that didn't need words. The dog had been there for him when no one else had been. As George gently dried Charlie off, the memories of those years, so long ago, came flooding back. He thought of Evelyn, his wife, and how she had been the one who convinced him to get that dog in the first place. Evelyn had always loved animals, especially dogs, but her health had never been good enough for her to care for one of her own. They had compromised by getting the dog for George, and at first, she had been hesitant, worried about the responsibility, but over time, the little dog had won her over, and she had adored it almost as much as George did. The dog had been their first real child, the first living being they had ever taken care of together. George swallowed hard, the weight of the memories pressing against his chest. That was before the war. Before everything had changed. After the war, after the losses, Evelyn's health had deteriorated further, and the dog had passed away. That was when the house had truly started to feel empty. When Evelyn had died, it had felt like everything he had known, everything that had made him feel connected to the world, was gone. The dog's death had been the beginning of the end of that life. Now, as he looked at Charlie, so small, so fragile, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to pull back, to keep the distance, to not allow this puppy into his heart the way he had allowed that dog in years ago. But another part of him, the part that had spent so many years fighting against the loneliness, knew that this was different. Charlie was a new beginning, a chance to heal old wounds, to find a way back to the kind of companionship he had lost. By the time Charlie had dried off and eaten, George had made up his mind. He was going to take the puppy to the vet. It was the responsible thing to do. Charlie needed care. He could tell that much. The animal wasn't just hungry, it was sickly, malnourished. A few minutes later, George bundled Charlie up in his coat, taking extra care to keep the puppy close to his chest. He didn't want Charlie to feel alone again. Not after all he had been through. At the vet's office, Charlie was nervous, but he sat quietly, nestled against George's side as the doctor examined him. The vet confirmed what George had already suspected. Charlie was dehydrated, malnourished, and had a few minor infections, but nothing that couldn't be treated. The relief that washed over George was palpable. Charlie wasn't in danger of dying, not yet. But he would need care, and George was prepared to give it. As the vet went over the treatment plan, George found himself lost in thought. He was older now, far older than he had been when he had cared for his first dog. But somehow, it didn't seem to matter. The love he had for that dog all those years ago hadn't disappeared, it had only waited. When they returned home, Charlie was quieter than before, exhausted from the visit but in better shape. The puppy curled up in the small bed George had made for him by the fireplace, his eyes closing slowly as he drifted off to sleep. George sat down in his chair, his gaze resting on the dog, a small smile tugging at his lips. The house still felt empty at times, but now there was warmth, a sense of purpose. Charlie's presence reminded him that even in the face of grief, there was always room for new connections, new memories. It was as if the dog had brought a piece of the past back into the present. And with that, George felt something shift inside him, a quiet understanding that perhaps it wasn't just the dog who needed healing. He needed it too. As Charlie slept soundly, George thought about the child inside, her presence just as new and unexpected. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. He wasn't ready to be the father or caretaker he had once been. But in his heart, he realized that he didn't have to be. He just had to be present. For Charlie, for the child, and for himself. It was enough for now. And it would have to be enough. It was a late afternoon when George first noticed something was wrong. He had just finished making his coffee and was about to settle into his usual chair by the window when he saw Charlie lying motionless on the floor near the fireplace. The little puppy hadn't moved all morning. And now, as George approached, he saw the tremors running through its tiny body. It wasn't like the dog to stay still for so long. Charlie was usually bouncing around, wagging his tail, his playful energy an odd but comforting presence in the quiet house. But today, there was only stillness. "Charlie," George called softly, kneeling down beside him. The puppy didn't respond, not even a twitch. A cold dread crawled up George's spine as he gently touched the dog's fur, feeling the warmth of its body but noticing the weakness in its limbs. The poor thing was limp, breathing in shallow, labored gasps. Panic tightened around George's chest. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know if it was something serious or just a passing illness, but he couldn't stand to see Charlie like this. He had already lost so much, and the thought of losing this small creature who had brought so much life back into his home was unbearable. Without wasting a second, George scooped Charlie into his arms and rushed him to the car. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, the thought of something happening to the puppy consuming his mind. He drove as quickly as he could, his old car sputtering in protest against the cold, his focus fixed solely on getting Charlie to the vet. The weight of the dog in his lap felt like 1,000 pounds. A burden he wasn't ready to bear. When they arrived at the veterinary clinic, George hurried inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The receptionist quickly ushered him into an examination room, and within minutes, a vet was examining Charlie. The room felt like it was closing in on George, the seconds stretching out impossibly long as he watched the doctor probe and examine the puppy. His mind raced with a dozen thoughts, none of them good. After a tense silence, the vet looked up, her face serious. "Mr. Miller," she began softly, "Charlie has a severe injury. There's a wound inside him, deep in his abdomen. It looks like it's been there for some time, possibly even months. Given the infection and the way it's spread, it's likely he was beaten before he was abandoned." George's stomach turned. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. Charlie had been abused before he'd been left on the streets. It was a cruel thought, one that made his heart ache for the little dog. He felt guilty for not noticing it sooner, guilty for not being able to protect Charlie from whatever had happened to him. But that wasn't the worst of it. "The injury is serious," the vet continued, her tone heavy. "He needs surgery to repair the damage and stop the infection from spreading. Otherwise, it could be fatal." George's breath caught in his throat. Surgery. He had no idea how much it would cost, but he could already feel the weight of his limited retirement income pressing down on him. He had scrimped and saved for years, but his pension barely covered his living expenses. Medical bills for the dog were far beyond what he could afford. And yet, looking at Charlie, who was still weak and barely conscious, George couldn't bring himself to consider the alternative. He couldn't imagine just giving up on him. Not after everything they had been through together. "How much will it cost?" George asked, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't bear to ask, but he needed to know. The vet hesitated for a moment before responding, her eyes sympathetic but firm. "The surgery, with everything included, the anesthesia, the aftercare, the medications, it will be around $2,000. George's heart sank. $2,000. The number echoed in his mind. The impossibility of it crashing down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. He didn't have that kind of money. He barely had enough to cover his bills. And now, to save this little dog, to give him the chance at a life George had promised to protect. He needed money he simply didn't have. He could already feel his hands shaking, his mind racing with calculations, with guilt, with regret. The thought of losing Charlie was unbearable, but the thought of not even trying to save him was worse. I don't have that much," George said, his voice faltering. "I can't afford that." The vet looked at him kindly, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. "I understand, Mr. Miller, but we can't do anything without the surgery. If you're unable to pay, we can keep him comfortable for now, but his chances of survival are slim without the procedure." George's heart was in his throat. The puppy had been through so much already. He couldn't let him die. Not after everything he had gone through to get to this point. But what choice did he have? His savings were almost gone, and there was no way to come up with the money. For the first time since he had found Charlie in the alley, George felt utterly helpless. The decision weighed heavily on him. Could he let the dog go, knowing it was the humane thing to do? Or should he fight for a life that seemed increasingly out of reach? He could already feel the sadness threatening to overwhelm him. But in his chest, there was also a small, flickering flame of resolve. He had promised himself, when he had taken Charlie in, that he would never abandon him. He had taken on this responsibility, and he couldn't back out now. "I'll find a way," George said, the words slipping from his mouth without hesitation, as if he was convincing himself more than anyone else. He stood up from the chair, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "I'll find a way to pay for the surgery. I can't just let him go." The vet gave him a sympathetic look, but she didn't argue. "If you're sure," she said softly, "we'll start prepping him for the procedure. But please, keep in mind that time is critical." George nodded, his mind already racing through possibilities. He could sell the car, maybe, or get a loan. He wasn't sure how he would manage. But he knew he couldn't let Charlie slip away. Not like this. As they took Charlie into the back for surgery, George stood in the waiting room, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. His mind spun in circles, chasing after solutions that didn't exist. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. He didn't have the money, didn't have the resources, and didn't even know if he could make it work. But one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't ready to lose Charlie. Not now. Not when he had just begun to understand how much they needed each other. For the first time in a long time, George felt like he had something worth fighting for. And this time, he wasn't going to give up. The days following the vet's diagnosis were the darkest George had faced in years. He had never felt so helpless, so torn between the desire to fight for something and the crushing reality of his limited means. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. Each moment spent watching Charlie's labored breathing making him feel more and more powerless. But he had promised the little dog that he wouldn't give up. And he intended to keep that promise. The thought of letting go was unbearable. Yet, when he stood in the small, quiet living room of his home, staring at the dust-covered shelves, his gaze fell upon the old wooden box that sat on the mantelpiece, Evelyn's box. It was a small chest, once a gift from her family, and inside it were the most precious memories of their time together. George had never touched the box after she passed. It was too painful to even think about. But now, with Charlie's life on the line, he found himself drawn to it. With trembling hands, George opened the chest, carefully lifting out a velvet-lined pouch. It was a gift from Evelyn on their anniversary, an old pocket watch with intricate engravings. She had insisted on it, even though George had always preferred simple things. She'd loved it dearly, kept it polished and cherished, and when she passed, it had become George's most treasured possession. The watch was the last link he had to her. The only thing that remained of their life together before the war. Before everything had changed, he had kept it safe, unwilling to part with it, because it felt like a piece of her was still with him. But now, as he turned the watch over in his hands, the decision seemed painfully clear. Charlie needed surgery, and the money for it seemed impossible to come by. The watch wasn't just a memory, it was the last piece of the past. The last piece of Evelyn, and George knew what he had to do. With a sigh, he put the watch back in the pouch, his fingers lingering on the soft velvet before he sealed it up once more. There was no hesitation. He sold the watch. It was all he could do to make sure Charlie had a fighting chance. He didn't know what it would feel like to part with something so personal. But in that moment, all that mattered was the dog lying in a sterile hospital room, fighting for his life. The money was enough. Barely, but it was enough. And when George returned to the clinic, Charlie was ready for surgery. The operation was long, the hours stretching on like days. George sat in the waiting room, hands clasped together in his lap, eyes staring blankly at the floor. His thoughts were a blur, a mess of worry and regret and hope. But eventually, the vet came to him with good news. The surgery had gone well. Charlie was stable for now. But he was weak, very weak, and would need a lot of time to recover. It wasn't over, but it was a start. For the next few weeks, George dedicated himself entirely to Charlie. He cared for the dog with a patience he didn't know he had. Spoon-feeding him meals, making sure he took his medicine, and sitting beside him for hours as he slept. Charlie didn't have the strength to run around the house anymore. But there were small victories along the way, times when Charlie would wag his tail ever so slightly, or lift his head up just a little higher, as if trying to meet George's gaze. It was progress, but it was slow, and every day, George felt his heart swell a little more. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the dog had clung to life. The way he had fought to stay with him. Or maybe it was something deeper. Something that had begun when George first took the puppy in. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't imagine his life without him now. And then, one morning, something changed. George awoke as he always did. Stiff from sleep, his mind already swirling with thoughts of the day ahead. But as he opened his eyes, he felt a presence near the bed. And then a soft nudge at his hand. He turned his head, his breath catching in his throat as he saw Charlie standing beside the bed. His tail wagging furiously. The puppy was still thin, still weak, but he was standing. He was alive. And when George reached down to stroke his fur, Charlie licked his hand, the softest, most joyful lick George had ever felt. For a moment, everything stopped. George's heart surged, a lump forming in his throat as the enormity of the moment washed over him. This little creature, so broken and fragile when he first found him, had come back to life. And George, who had spent so many years alone in this house, who had resigned himself to a life of solitude, realized that he wasn't alone anymore. Charlie was there. Charlie had chosen him, and somehow, that made everything better. For the first time in a long time, George felt the weight of his loneliness lift. If only for a moment. He wasn't just caring for a dog. He was healing, too. He had been broken, just like Charlie, and together, they had found something, not just in each other, but in the simple act of caring, of giving something to another living being without expectation. And in that, George understood that his life wasn't as empty as he had thought. That morning, George stood up, his bones aching as he stretched. He smiled down at Charlie, who was now wagging his tail excitedly. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, the dog's presence, the warmth of the home, the quiet of the morning. And then, without a word, he grabbed Charlie's leash and slipped it on. Opening the door, they walked out into the cold morning air. The streets of the small town quiet and still. The world just beginning to wake up. The first hints of sunlight streamed over the horizon, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. George and Charlie walked side by side, the rhythm of their footsteps in sync, both of them moving forward, together. As they reached the end of the street, George stopped and looked down at the little dog beside him. Charlie's eyes met his, and for the first time, George saw something he had been missing for so long: trust. A bond formed through struggle, through healing. They were two souls, once fractured and scarred, now finding their way back to each other, step by step. And in that moment, George understood that it wasn't just the house that had been healed. It was him. He wasn't alone anymore. He had found a companion, a reason to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep living. And as he and Charlie walked on together, the world felt a little brighter, a little warmer, and for the first time in many years, George smiled, genuinely, with the full weight of his heart behind it. He wasn't alone anymore, and he never would be again.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.